January in northern Minnesota signals the start of ice fishing for people like me. My co-workers at the warehouse, where I handled truck loading, had buzzed about Lake Winnebago's for weeks, scheming a team outing that kept facing delays. But that Saturday morning, right after my divorce documents arrived, 10 years of marriage shrunk to a single manila envelope, I chose to head out solo. At 34, I felt worn out that day, my breath misting the Ford F-150's windshield as I arrived at the deserted lot by the public access around 6 a.m. The lake sprawled like a vast white plain, utterly calm, with a hush so profound it buzzed in your ears. I'd been ice fishing ever since my dad brought me along at age 7, so I figured I had it covered. Or so I believed. The weather report had forecasted sunny conditions and temps around 15 degrees. Chilly, sure, but doable for a whole day out there. I dragged my pop-up shelter, auger, and gear bucket roughly 300 yards from the edge beyond the permanent fish houses clustered nearer to shore. Solitude was what I craved, actually what I required, and the location I picked was off by itself, close to a spot where walleye gather in the deeper sections. By 7:30, I'd bored my holes, pitched the tent, and baited my initial line. The ice underfoot seemed sturdy, about 10 inches deep from the auger chips. I recall how soothing it was, alone with the chill and the steady jiggle of my rod tip. No attorneys, no fights over the property, no sight of my now ex-wife stuffing her belongings into cartons, just frozen water and potential catches. About 11 o'clock, a breeze kicked up from the northwest. At first it wasn't concerning, merely consistent blasts that fluttered and popped against my shelter's sides. I went out to inspect my tip-ups, the flag setups I'd placed roughly 20 yards off in a loose arrangement. The heavens had shifted in my absence, from sharp winter azure to a dull gray that weighed on the landscape. The distant permanent shacks appeared shrunken, more remote than I'd gauged. I dismissed it as the even lighting fooling my eyes, the way a frozen lake warps under incoming clouds. I fetched my coffee thermos from the sled and sipped some, observing the vapor twist and dissolve in the frigid air. A handful of other vehicles had pulled into the lot. I spotted their small forms by the bank, but no one had come this distance. That ought to have tipped me off. That trouble was brewing. I was pulling up a little perch around 6 inches when the sound hit. A low, rumbling moan echoing from all sides, pulsing through my soles and into my torso. Ice groans constantly on large lakes, shifting and settling with spooky noises that spook beginners, but get tuned out by old hands. Yet this was off. It came with a crisp snap, like gunfire, off to the north behind me. I laid my rod aside and stepped to the boundary of my setup, peering over the blank vista. That's when I saw my tackle box had shifted. Not toppled or blown by gusts, it had glided some 3 feet leftward, etching a light trail on the ice. I froze, gazing at it, my mind grappling with the sight. Then it hit under my boots, a faint nauseating slant, akin to deck tilt on a boat hitting swells. I knelt and slapped my hand flat on the surface, probing for shifts. It was damp now, slippery with a fresh layer of melt that hadn't appeared earlier. My pulse raced as I lurched toward shore, or where I assumed shore lay. That's when it hit me full force. A ragged black fissure slicing the white about 40 feet in front, extending endlessly both ways. Exposed water. The split had severed my ice chunk from the larger flow. And the wind was driving it, nudging my whole icy raft, gradually but relentlessly toward Lake Winnebagos's heart. I dashed to the shelter and yanked my phone from my coat. No bars. Naturally out in remote Minnesota, with the closest tower likely 15 miles off. I waved it skyward anyway, as if that'd do a thing, staring at the blank signal while the platform under me kept its insidious creep. The water gap was growing. From perhaps 3 feet wide at first glance, it now spanned 8 or 10. The inky depths swirling with ice shards. I considered sprinting across the gap and vaulting over it before the divide grew any larger. Yet the rim of my ice flow was rough and precarious, with chunks breaking away into the depths right before my eyes. A single misstep or error in judgment, and I'd tumble into water at 30 degrees, burdened by my bulky winter clothing. Hypothermia would strike quickly, in mere minutes. I'd once learned that in such frigid conditions, you get roughly 10 minutes of useful activity before your muscles seize up, and perhaps an hour until your body core chills fatally low. The shoreline now appeared endlessly distant, just a faint shadowy streak against the skyline, dotted with the vibrant specks of those fishing huts I'd gone by earlier. I yelled for assistance, hands cupped to my mouth, bellowing until my voice grew raw. But the gale devoured every cry, whisking it off into oblivion. I compelled myself to halt the rising fear and reason things out. My dad had always said that panic claims lives quicker than the chill itself, that your mind serves as the ultimate lifesaver if you manage to keep it sharp. I assessed my possessions, the foldable shelter, my ice drill, a sled loaded with tackle, around 50 feet of line, a compact propane unit, chemical warmers, half a devoured sandwich, and a thermos of coffee that had cooled to tepid. No signal flares, no distress transmitter, nothing tailored for this precise horror. The flow beneath me spanned about the area of a tennis court, perhaps slightly more. And I sensed it turning gradually as the breeze and undertow vied for control of its path. Glancing at my wristwatch, it read 12:47 p.m. Dusk would arrive near 5, dropping the mercury from chilly to lethal afterward. I figured I had roughly 4 hours to devise a plan before nightfall compounded the peril. The overcast sky had grown denser, and I detected the crisp tang of impending snow, that sharp, steely aroma familiar to anyone who's endured harsh northern seasons. I resolved that my top hope lay in drawing attention. I dismantled the shelter and laid its vivid orange material out across the surface, anchoring the edges with the gearbox, the drill, and slabs of ice. I edged back from the perimeter with careful steps. Viewed from above, it could resemble an SOS marker. Up close, through field glasses, someone might spot the anomaly if they scanned the area. I continually fiddled with my cell, pacing various points on the flow in search of even one signal bar. Yet the display remained blank. The chasm of water separating me from the solid ice mass had stretched to at least 30 feet, a murky stream throbbing with sinister force. I noticed my perch wasn't even. Parts gleamed thick and pale, while others showed darker, frailer spots eroded by the flow from below. In my mind, I charted the secure areas, lingering by the heart where the surface felt firmest and steering clear of the borders, where fissures radiated like cracks in glass with each wind gust. Just past 2 p.m., the initial fracture occurred. I caught the noise first, a harsh, ripping crack akin to fracturing limbs. Then a slab as large as a dinner table on the northern edge simply canted and slipped beneath the surface. I observed it float briefly before the flow dragged it down, vanished in an instant. My safe space was contracting. I shifted all my belongings inward, stacking the equipment in a compact heap beside me, and ignited the propane device. Though I realized fuel conservation mattered, my digits had lost sensation within the mittens. And preserving my inner heat was crucial to outlast until potential rescuers spotted my absence. The issue was, no one would realize I was gone. My colleagues assumed I was brooding alone post-split. My former spouse had zero interest in my whereabouts. My folks had relocated to Florida for retirement, and our chats were limited to weekly calls. I'd shared my destination with nobody, filed no itinerary, just motored out in a haze of regret and plunked myself onto this vast, iced-over expanse like a fool. The flakes began around 2:30, heavy damp ones slashing sight lines to perhaps 100 yards. The land vanished entirely, replaced by uniform whiteness everywhere. Horizon and frozen plain blended into an endless blankness. The flow had wandered so far that estimating the water's width proved futile, maybe 50 feet or 500. I crouched by the warmer, shrouded in the shelter's folded cloth for added warmth, and pondered my prospects. Should anyone spy my vehicle in the lot come evening, they'd have no clue where to search. The body of water spanned more than 60,000 acres, and by now I could drift to any corner. Rescue operations would require vessels or choppers, and amid this storm, they might delay until dawn. My thoughts turned to Dad, imagining his dismay at my recklessness landing me here. He'd always warned that the lake never overlooks errors, insisting you must honor it each time your boots touch the ice. Today, I hadn't shown that respect. My head was too clouded by personal despair to notice the subtle cues that had likely been present from the start. Dusk was settling in when the engine noise reached me. Initially, I dismissed it as a trick of my frantic mind, conjuring comfort from thin air. Yet the sound intensified, a sharp mechanical hum slicing the gusts, prompting me to leap up so quickly I almost skidded on the slick surface. Clutching the bright orange shanty material, I flailed it above my head, shouting incoherent pleas, pure desperation, anything to catch notice. Squinting through the flurry, I spotted it, a lone beam jiggling over the icy expanse, an airboat speeding in from the southeast. Perhaps someone had noticed my vehicle, or glimpsed the vivid cloth amid the worsening storm, or it was sheer chance that a conservation officer was on a standard sweep. The craft swung in a broad arc around my dwindling ice patch, the operator evaluating the peril. Then a voice boomed from a speaker, urging me to remain steady, hold position, avoid the rim. On their third attempt, they tossed a sturdy yellow rope that fell just 5 feet away. With numb fingers, I secured it around my midsection. They reeled me over the divide, towing me past the treacherous brink and through 6 feet of icy depths before yanking me aboard like a snagged trout. The officer, Colleen, a tough-looking woman with little tolerance for chit-chat, swaddled me in warming layers and blasted the heater full force. She explained how fortunate I was. Another hour, and the current would have shattered the flow entirely. Hypothermia was taking hold, she noted from my intense trembling. By the shore, where an ambulance waited, my body heat had sunk to 94 degrees. After 2 nights at the hospital in Baiji, I healed from slight frostbite on 3 fingertips and a bone-deep fatigue. The medics estimated I'd escaped a grim fate by roughly 40 minutes. That figure haunts me these days. 40 minutes, separating survival from becoming a thawed corpse come spring. That summer, I offloaded my angling equipment, donated the shelter, the drill, everything. Folks urged me to return, claiming fear shouldn't dictate my choices. But they missed the point. It wasn't terror holding me back. It was reverence, the sort my dad emphasized. The lesson I absorbed painfully on a January Saturday when the ice enforced that the wild ignores your troubles, your split, your grief. It simply proceeds, and you either stay vigilant or face the consequences. Those who've endured a true blizzard recognize its eerie hush. That oppressive, sound-dampening stillness, like being entombed while still breathing, even within your walls. I'd been residing in my late grandmother's weathered farmhouse in rural Wisconsin for around 8 months when the fiercest tempest in 15 years barreled in. She'd died the prior spring, bequeathing me the place, which I saw as a cue to rebuild after my marriage crumbled. My high school class marked their 10-year gathering that year, hinting at my stage, wise to pitfalls, yet prone to folly. The home perched at the terminus of a 2-mile secluded lane, ringed by barren cornfields and thick evergreens. My closest neighbor, an aged tiller called Walt Hugh Bard, was distant enough that my loudest cries would echo unheard. That solitude had never fazed me earlier. Seclusion was my goal, to vanish temporarily, rediscover myself unbound by a spouse's shadow. Yet as the National Weather Service broadcast a dire blizzard alert that Monday, forecasting up to 3 feet of accumulation and brutal wind chills, the isolation's burden hit hard. I devoted the morning to fortifying against disaster. The cupboards brimmed with tins, noodles, grains, and water jugs for a full month. I'd topped off the tub as extra reserve. A savvy tip from Grandma during my childhood stays over winter holidays. The living room's wood burner served as main warmth, and I'd been chopping and piling logs since fall, confident of heat through a power outage lasting days. By midday, the heavens shifted to that ominous grayish-green hue signaling trouble, with initial snowflakes falling near 2 o'clock. In 3 hours, the vintage shed, just 40 yards behind the dwelling, vanished from sight. A faint shadow stood out amid the endless blanket of white. Around 5 o'clock, the wind intensified, whistling fiercely through the cracks in the window panes and causing the entire cabin to rattle as if it might collapse. I fixed myself a basic meal of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, consuming it huddled on the sofa near the fireplace while attempting to assure myself that all was well. I felt secure. I'd taken every precaution. Out in this isolation, no harm could reach me. Then, shortly past 7, a sound hit me that tensed every fiber in my frame. A faint, urgent rapping echoed from my front entrance. I froze in place for what seemed an eternity, perched on the sofa with my vacant soup bowl resting in my lap, fixated on the door as though it had sprouted fangs. No one ever ventured this way. Absolutely no one. The postal worker avoided my lane entirely during winter months. That's why I relied on a post office box in the nearby settlement. Walt Hubbard, at 83, had made it clear he stayed indoors from December through March, except in cases of life or death emergencies. The rapping returned, sharper now, laced with panic. And amid the gale's roar, I caught another sound, a female voice, shrill and quivering with fear. I placed the bowl on the side table and rose cautiously, my pulse thundering in my ears. The voice rang out once more distinct, and I discerned the plea. "Please, I need your help. Let me inside." It carried an edge of pure anguish, the kind born of real dread. I approached the door on unsteady limbs that didn't feel like my own, then peered through the narrow pane in the upper section. The sight stole my breath. On the porch was a young woman clad only in a lightweight sweater and jeans. No outerwear, no head covering, no mittens. Her arms clutched her torso tightly, and despite the icy film on the glass, I could see her shivering uncontrollably. She appeared around 22 or 23, her dark hair matted to her face by the driving snow and gusts, her complexion bearing that pale, icy hue from severe frostbite risk. Spotting me, her expression softened in gratitude, tears carving paths down her snow-dusted face. Quote one, she wept, flattening her hands against the door. Quote two. Her pleas spilled forth in a frantic torrent, and without thinking, my hand moved toward the bolt. All my gut reactions urged me to aid her, to warm her up, to rescue her from the horror she'd fled. My fingertips grazed the chilly latch, but then the breeze veered, and I noticed them. The storage shed, a low-slung wooden outbuilding my grandfather had erected back in the 70s, crouched roughly 40 yards from the house's rear edge. For hours, it had blended into the stormy haze as a vague outline. Yet as the wind whipped the flakes laterally rather than vertically, a brief window of clarity opened, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, and that sufficed. 2 shapes loomed behind the shed, shielded somewhat by its mass, their gazes locked on the dwelling. They weren't advancing, seeking cover, or behaving like sensible folks in a snowstorm. They simply lingered in the blackness, motionless like sentinels, eyes trained on the spot where the woman implored entry. Their features escaped me. The distance and faint illumination obscured them. But their forms cut sharply against the snowy backdrop. Both were hefty, wide across the shoulders, bundled in heavy dark garb. One gripped a slender, elongated object in his right fist. The wind turned once more, swallowing them in the flurry. Still, I knew my eyes hadn't deceived me. I yanked my hand from the bolt as if scorched. The woman outside kept sobbing, kept entreating, her tone fracturing under raw urgency. Quote 3. She pounded the door with her hand, and I recoiled, stumbling over the carpet's fringe. Thoughts whirled in my head, scrambling to rationalize the glimpse. Perhaps they were fellow fugitives, having broken free alongside her but too terrified to draw near. Or maybe I was overreacting, and they were unfamiliar locals patrolling homes amid the weather. Yet nothing justified their concealment. Nothing accounted for their surveillance over assistance, and nothing clarified the woman's sidelong glances toward the house's flank, as if monitoring a presence. I retreated deeper into the sitting area, clutching the sofa's rear for balance. Quote underscore 4 underscore, I announced firmly, ensuring she could hear me through the barrier. Help is on the way for you. Just remain where you are, and I'll make sure someone arrives soon. What followed is etched in my memory forever, something I'll carry to my grave. The sobbing ceased abruptly. It didn't ease gradually or dissolve into whimpers or hushed cries. It halted instantly, as if a button had been pressed to silence it. For an instant, silence reigned, broken only by the howling wind and the snapping flames from the fireplace at my back. Then her voice returned, utterly transformed. The quivering fear, the urgency, the sheer panic, all vanished. In their place came a monotone, serene tone, bordering on indifference. "That won't do any good," she stated. Her words emerged measured and precise, as though instructing a slow-witted kid on an obvious fact. Paralyzed in the center of my living room, I gazed at the door, struggling to connect this voice with the shattered, tear-streaked figure I'd glimpsed moments before. She wasn't even acting now. Peering through the narrow window, I noticed her features had shifted too. The twisted mask of dread had flattened into an impassive, waiting neutrality. She cocked her head a bit, reminiscent of a curious pup catching an odd noise, and fixed her gaze right on the window, fully aware of my watchful eyes. "The phone lines are severed," she announced, that eerie, even timbre slicing through the gale. "Cell service has been dead for hours. No one's coming to your aid." My cell lay forgotten on the kitchen counter. I hadn't glanced at it in more than an hour, possibly more. Part of me itched to dash over and disprove her, but my body refused to budge. I couldn't tear my eyes from her vacant stare in the glass, that emotionless void staring back. No rage, no irritation, no feeling whatsoever. It resembled a flesh-toned facade. "You should have let me in right away," she added, her inflection carrying a hint of sincere regret, as if lamenting my poor decision. "It would have ended quicker." With that, she swiveled toward the rear of the property, in the spot where I'd spotted those lurking shadows, and gave a single brisk nod. A tiny gesture loaded with implication, validating every nightmarish fear racing through my mind. Footfalls echoed next. Heavy, crunching steps through the snow, approaching from the house's flank, heading straight for the rear entrance. At last, I shook off the stupor holding me captive and bolted to the kitchen, desperately hoping I'd secured the back door, that the bolt would withstand pressure, that this was merely a vivid bad dream from which I'd soon awaken. The back door held firm. I arrived as a silhouette flickered across the tiny pane in its top section, and I pounded the deadbolt to confirm it was latched tight. It was an antique slab of oak my grandfather had installed years back, but the surrounding frame dated to the house's origins, a century-plus old and far frailer than I'd prefer. With shaking hands, I snatched my phone from the counter and stared at the display. No bars. She'd spoken true on that point, at least. The landline sat in the living room, that old corded relic my grandma refused to discard, so I raced back to seize it. Lifeless. Just hollow quiet when I held the receiver to my ear, They'd severed it outdoors somewhere, likely hours earlier, while I dined obliviously, smug in my readiness. A resounding bang against the back door whipped me around, and a man's growl pierced the wood for the first time, deep and gravelly, barely audible. Quote 10, he demanded. No pleading, no fabricated tale, no charade, merely an order, delivered with the assurance of compliance. A fiercer impact followed, rattling the door in its casing. I required a means to fight back. The realization pierced my terror cleanly and crisply. I had to arm myself, for these intruders would breach my home regardless, and I wouldn't yield without resistance. Grandma stashed a shotgun in the hall closet, a 12-gauge Remington she'd fired to deter coyotes from her chicken coop. I'd never shot it personally, but I'd observed her plenty, and I knew it stayed chambered. She insisted an empty firearm was as pointless as a teapot of chocolate. I dashed to the closet, flung it wide, and rifled through the shadows until my fingers closed on the well-known walnut grip propped in the corner. I seized it, flicked the safety as I'd seen her do countless times, and took up a stance in the corridor, eyes on both entrances. The pounding at the back had ceased, leaving only the gale and my labored breaths in the quiet. Then came a grimmer noise, the brittle snap of timber from the mudroom area. That overlooked side door I'd nearly blanked on. They'd zeroed in on the most vulnerable spot. The mudroom entrance was a pathetic excuse for a door. Just a flimsy hollow core panel that the former owner had slapped up back in the 90s. Ever since settling into the place, I'd planned to swap it out. I'd even checked prices on sturdy solid wood options at the local hardware shop. But with winter bearing down and a laundry list of other headaches, I kept delaying. That hesitation was about to cost me my life. A sharper crack rang out this time, followed by repeated thuds of something massive slamming against the door. I leveled the shotgun at the mudroom threshold, fighting to hold my arms firm, recalling every lesson from my grandmother. She'd always insisted that the unmistakable rack of a shotgun shell could scare off trouble before it escalated. I pulled it back right then, the sharp chunk reverberating down the corridor, and bellowed as loud as I could. "I've got a firearm here. I'll fire if I have to. Stay clear of my home." Silence fell instantly. The pounding ceased. Even the gale outside seemed to pause. Rooted in the hallway, I clutched the shotgun tighter as its weight bore down, icy sweat trickling along my forehead in the chill. I counted off the seconds, 5, 10, 15. Then a voice pierced the quiet, nearly sending me crumbling. A woman's. Right on the other side of the mudroom door, so near she must have slipped from the front porch during my distraction. "She has a gun," she announced in that emotionless drawl, the words filtering through the battered panel. "Remington looks like a 12-gauge. Stillness returned. I caught faint whispers from them, muffled by the raging storm, before steps retreated from the mudroom. They were heading to the rear of the property, toward whatever lurked beyond my view. No clue if they were fleeing or just repositioning. I was paralyzed by fear. Frozen in the hall. Time blurred after that. 5 minutes? 20? With the shotgun hoisted, my shoulders ached fiercely, eyes stinging from unblinking strain. The wind wailed on. The wood stove's flames snapped and hissed. Gradually, another noise cut in, an engine rumble, starting soft, then building, paired with the grind of tires over packed snow. Beams from headlights flashed across the living room window, a car door thunked shut, then a second one, and a man's yell drifted over, too garbled to catch. I kept the gun up. Didn't budge. Just trembled in place until a solid rap echoed from the front entrance. A commanding knock, then the phrase I'd desperately hoped for. "County Sheriff, ma'am. We received a report of a potential intrusion at this residence. Everything okay inside?" It took ages to reply. How could they have gotten word when my phones were out? Gun still aimed high, I edged toward the front door, peeking through the glass to verify. 2 officers in uniform waited on the porch. A sheriff's cruiser idled in the drive, its blue and red strobes pulsing against the snow. "Quote 14, I rasped, my throat raw and voice foreign to me. The senior deputy, a stocky guy with a silver mustache, bent toward the door. 15. At last, I dropped the shotgun's barrel and fumbled the door open with frozen hands. I probably resembled a disaster zone since the deputies rushed in without hesitation, probing if I'd been injured. I spilled the whole tale, the woman, her sobs, the pair skulking by the shed, the shift in her tone, the assault on the mudroom. They combed the grounds with their beams, spotting boot prints scattered about, already blanketed in new powder. The mudroom door dangled from a single hinge, its frame shattered from repeated boots. Tire marks trailed off at the driveway's edge, pointing back to the highway. But the blizzard buried any trail fast. The pair hung around till daylight, alternating sentry duty while one catnapped in the fireside chair. As the tempest eased at first light, reinforcements rolled in, including a sleuth from the county hub who made me recount the ordeal thrice over. Those intruders from that frigid night, they slipped the net. The detective shared down the line that this scam, deploying a distressed girl to lure residents into unlocking, had cropped up in several remote spots that year, striking only in brutal weather and zeroing in on lone homes. He called me fortunate. He mentioned that the average person would have flung that door open without a second thought. 6 weeks later, I put my grandmother's place on the market, sold it quickly, and headed back to the city, landing in an apartment complex complete with a doorman, surveillance cameras, and folks living right next door on all sides. Even now, on certain nights, that woman's expression haunts my dreams. The one in the window, shifting from frantic longing to utter vacancy in the blink of an eye. And I often recall Walt Hubbard, 83 years young, peering down the road through his binoculars amid a raging snowstorm, dialing the sheriff because things just didn't sit right. Before packing up and leaving town, I dropped off a fine bottle of whiskey and a heartfelt thank you note. Whether he realized he'd pulled me back from the brink that evening, I'll never know. But it's etched in my memory forever. None of it will ever fade from my mind. By February 2022, I was 6 months deep into what my divorce attorney dubbed the recovery phase, and what I simply saw as banishment. Turning 34 hit differently when you were rebuilding from scratch. Offloading the Portland home, snagging a work-from-home gig at a tech firm, and settling into a rented farmhouse on the outskirts of Vermont that ran cheaper monthly than my previous auto loan. The land stretched across 11 acres of pure birch groves and quiet. The closest person around was a dairy farmer called Gus Whitmore, situated roughly 2 miles along Hadley Road. Isolation was exactly what I'd craved, a chance to reclaim my thoughts after 3 relentless years of fights, blame, and doors banging shut. My golden retriever, Penny, seemed like all the companionship I'd require. Or at least that's the line I fed myself on those endless winter evenings, with gales ripping through the hollow and the antique heaters rattling as if someone were pounding from within. I'd adapted to the house's quirks over time, like how the planks underfoot would sigh in the chill, or how frost would snap and rattle the panes like impatient fingers. I figured I'd mastered its every murmur. That Wednesday kicked off no differently from the rest of the week. Overcast heavens, coffee that stayed lukewarm, and a 9 a.m. meeting where I kept the video dark since I hadn't run a comb through my hair in 48 hours. Forecasters noted a front pushing down from Canada, par for the course in a Vermont February. So I piled logs by the entrance and topped off the generator's tank. Come midday, flakes began tumbling in heavy sheets, swallowing the treetops in under 60 minutes. I recall lingering by the kitchen pane, Penny leaning into my calf, as the landscape outside dissolved into a blank, swirling void. A strange calm settling in from the certainty that mobility was off the table and visitors weren't an option. Just past 3 p.m., the lights flickered out with a gentle pop, plunging the home into the thick quiet that settles once the buzz of power fades away. Candles flickered to life, flames danced in the stove, and I almost welcomed the break from the digital world. Then my cell vibrated with an urgent notification, cracking that tentative tranquility like a heel crunching thin ice. The alert was curt and detached, typical of official dispatches. A prisoner had bolted during a convoy mishap on Route 12, about 9 miles out from me. His identity: Carl Eugene Vickers, age 41, doing 18 years for severe battery and holdup with a weapon. Deemed a threat, potentially packing heat. Last spotted veering northwest toward the Green Mountain National Forest, straight into the wilds abutting my land. Folks were urged to secure every entry, flag anything odd, and steer clear of the outdoors pending more info. I scanned the warning thrice, rooted in the shadowy kitchen with the stove popping softly and drifts mounting outside. 9 miles wasn't a huge gap. On a clear day, a driven soul could hoof it there in hours. But amid a blinding gale with the mercury plunging under zero, survival seemed improbable for long. That's the reassurance I clung to while reinforcing the front latch and jamming a chair against the rear exit to the entryway. The freeze would halt him first, no doubt. To kill time as daylight waned toward dusk, I doled out kibble to Penny, warmed broth over the fire, and pored over a book by waxlight, while the tempest raged beyond like a beast in agony. Periodically, I'd glance at my device for news, though reception was spotty and fading fast. One pulsing signal that vanished by 6. The solitude that morning had tasted like liberty. Now it closed in, dense and oppressive from every angle. Suddenly, I was attuned to the dwelling like never before, dissecting each snap and sigh, sifting routine creaks from potential intruders. Gusts battered the northward panes with relentless flurries. Occasionally, I'd nearly convince myself that footsteps echoed on the porch amid the chaos. a steady crunching rhythm that kicked off, halted, and picked up once more. Yet whenever I tugged the curtain aside and pressed a candle against the pane, nothing appeared, except endless white. Only the tempest, I repeated inwardly. Simply limbs tumbling down, the aged structure groaning against the frost. Penny sprawled beside the wood stove, chin resting on her paws, her steady brown gaze tracking my restless steps. I recall deciding right then that her lack of concern meant I had no reason to fret myself. That shifted near 9 o'clock. I'd just tossed another log onto the flames and sunk into the armchair under a quilt when Penny's head shot up, ears perked alert, her frame stiffening like dogs do upon catching a sound beyond human reach. Her focus locked on the floor, not the entrance or the panes, but squarely on that outdated heating grate by the baseboard, the one the former residents had fitted with some slatted shield. A soft rumble rose in her chest, barely audible at first, like I might have dreamed it up, then swelling into a fierce snarl unlike anything she'd ever uttered. Penny had always been my most placid pup, the sort to welcome outsiders with joyful tail wags, aggressive only toward the Hoover. But there she was, snarling at the vent, lips curled off her fangs, fur bristling along her back in a sharp crest. I stayed rooted in the seat, observing her pulse hammering fiercely in my ears. Her stare never left that grate, and then, under the howling gusts and snapping blaze, I caught it myself. A subtle scrape, clear as day though faint, rising from somewhere under the floorboards. The old farmhouse featured a basement I'd never bothered with. The last renter had cautioned me about it during lease signing, mentioning the decayed steps and its tendency to flood come springtime. I'd ventured down once, shortly after settling in, and discovered only decaying rock walls, an earthen ground, and a gloom that devoured my light beam whole. Access came via two routes, an inside portal in the corridor, which I secured with a padlock on my end, and outside bulkhead panels on the building's eastern flank, swinging open from the surface. Those bulkheads bore a sturdy iron hasp from within, along with a protective mesh the owner had added ages back, following a burglary at one of his other spots. I'd inspected that mesh upon arrival, yanked it to confirm its strength, then largely put it out of mind. But now, huddled in my flickering den with my hound, rumbling at the planks, the basement loomed in my thoughts with sharp, near-hysterical detail. I considered how the outer panels lay smothered in drifts. I pondered how the inner barrier sat merely 15 feet along the passage from my spot. And I dwelled on the noise I'd just detected, that drag across rock, like an object hauled over stone. Sleep evaded me entirely that evening. Each time my lids drooped, Penny would rumble anew, jolting me wide awake, ears straining for her phantom echoes. The basement noises ebbed and flowed unpredictably, stretches of quiet lasting 20 or 30 minutes, broken by abrupt bangs or rasps that startled us both. By midnight, a fresh disturbance emerged, a tinkling of metal, steady and purposeful, reminiscent of a tool striking bars. I recognized it instantly, the barrier mesh. Someone lurked below, probing the bars for vulnerabilities. I snatched my cell and punched 911, only for the display to mock me with, quote, 16 in stark letters. Rage surged. I ached to hurl it at the plaster. The fixed phone line was out as well. The gale had surely snapped the cables, just like the electricity. Isolation gripped me fully. Trapped in this dwelling with my mutt, a bolted barrier, and the source of those disturbances a mere 15 feet off. Escape tempted me. Scoop up Penny and dash through the main exit into the gale. But drifts towered 3 feet against the veranda, and the mercury had plunged to -15. I'd turned to ice long before reaching Gus Whitmore's place. Instead, I endured. I perched in the armchair, a butcher knife balanced on my thighs, and a hefty frying pan close at hand, eyes fixed on the corridor, on Penny, on the murmurs from beneath. The tapping dragged on for what seemed an eternity, frenzied bursts, then patient probes. I strained to envision the scene below, a figure groping in shadows, fingers chilled to the bone, fumbling at the fasteners securing the mesh, frantic for the shelter's warmth. The vision gripped me so tightly I could nearly glimpse the intruder, nearly taste the mingled reek of perspiration, terror, and icy resolve. Every couple of minutes, Penny would glance up at me with those anxious eyes, and I'd murmur to her that everything was fine, that we were secure, that the grate would endure. Deep down, though, I didn't buy it. The noises persisted, sharp clashes of metal against metal. Then, sometime near 3 a.m., a fresh sound emerged, a deep creak of strain, as if pressure was finally overwhelming something. I clutched the knife until my knuckles throbbed with pain. The creaking halted, followed by utter quiet, broken only by the howling wind, the crackling fire, and my own labored breaths through the remaining hours of darkness. Daylight arrived gradually and bleakly, the blizzard tapering off into sporadic snowflakes that floated by the panes like drifting cinders. I'd stayed rooted in that armchair for a full 8 hours, my muscles screaming in unfamiliar spots. Neck stiff, shoulders knotted, lower back twisted like a clenched hand. Penny had dozed off around 5, tucked into a compact bundle by my feet, but sleep eluded me completely. As the initial rays filtered past the drapes, I compelled myself to rise, bones cracking and legs wobbling unsteadily. I had to check. I needed confirmation that the night's disturbances weren't a figment of my imagination, that the solitude and terror hadn't unraveled my sanity. Slipping into my boots and thickest jacket, I seized the kitchen blade and ventured onto the rear deck for the first time since the gale hit. The landscape beyond was a vast, hushed expanse of white, eerily motionless, the sort of quiet that whispers, "You're the sole survivor on Earth." Then my gaze dropped to the snow near the foundation, and certainty washed over me. I hadn't hallucinated a thing. Footprints. Imprints that were deep and weighty in the pristine powder, tracing a full loop around the property's edge. They began at the tree line roughly 50 yards distant and meandered closer, suggesting their maker was hunting, probing entrances and panes before continuing. My eyes tracked the path, vapor puffing from my mouth in uneven bursts, as it curved by the front steps, skirted the kitchen glass where I'd monitored the tempest, veered along the northern flank, past the antique propane tank half submerged in a mound, and so on. The prince orbited the structure thrice before halting abruptly at the outer basement access on the eastern wall. I approached cautiously, knife gripped in my chilled grip. The panels were nearly entombed in drifts, yet clearly someone had excavated them. I spotted the churned powder, the scratches in the frost from desperate scraping. The doors remained shut, iron bolt intact from my view. Yet the tracks didn't continue. They terminated there, vanishing as though the intruder had dissolved into the soil or descended into the depths unseen. Panic overtook me. Without a second thought or strategy, I scooped up Penny and the vehicle keys, battling through the drifts to my Subaru, which was mired to its hubs in the drive. It required 15 minutes of desperate shoveling with ungloved hands to expose the door. 10 more to jostle the vehicle loose from its icy trap. By the moment the motor roared to life, my digits were frost-bitten and raw, but it didn't matter. I sped directly to Gus Whitmore's place, skidding along Hadley Road at reckless velocities that threatened to send me careening off the path, then hammered on his entrance until he appeared in his robe, shotgun at the ready. I probably seemed deranged, eyes frantic, body quivering, palms smeared with blood from frostbite gashes, my frantic ramblings spilling out too rapidly for even me to follow. Gus simply absorbed it, gave a single nod, and dialed the county sheriff via his old phone, while his spouse, Eleanor, swaddled me in a quilt and thrust a steaming cup of coffee into my icy palms. The officers showed up in under an hour, a pair of fresh-faced guys who scarcely seemed old enough to wield razors. I guided them to my land to reveal the evidence. For 3 hours, they combed the timberland at my rear. From the kitchen vantage, I observed, Penny leaning into me as they plodded through the drifts, beams from their torches slicing the gloom. Walkie-talkies crackling with muffled exchanges. Deeper in the woods, they uncovered additional tracks near the tree line, traces of a crude lean-to fashioned from downed limbs about a quarter-mile in. A shredded scrap of orange cloth snagged on thorns caught their eye, matching the hue of inmate garb. Still, they overlooked the area beneath the dwelling. I recounted the auditory warnings, the protective grate, the trail concluding at the basement entry without re-emerging. They acknowledged with courteous dips of the head, assuring further investigation. But I caught their sidelong looks, the skeptical flicker they shared. Just a lone female unnerved by solitude, it implied. Likely fabricated most of it. By midday, they departed with vows to monitor the vicinity, and I lingered in the drive, eyeing their patrol car fade along Hadley Road. I had never felt such profound isolation before. I couldn't bear to spend another evening in that home. I quickly gathered some essentials, got Penny into the vehicle, and headed to a motel in Burlington, where I holed up for the following 7 days, startled by every noise, keeping the lights blazing while I tried to rest. I contacted my landlord and informed him I was terminating the rental agreement. I said he could retain the security deposit, that finances weren't my concern. Initially, he resisted, even warning of potential lawsuits. Yet once I described the events, the blizzard, the escaped convict, the eerie noises from below, his tone shifted dramatically. He fell silent for an extended pause before mentioning he'd dispatch someone to inspect the site. 3 days afterward, he reached out again. His speech had altered, sounding tense and empty, as if he'd encountered an inexplicable sight. The team discovered the basement's security bars twisted outward from within. A couple of the fasteners had snapped right off, There were deep scratches on the inside of the basement door, brutal gashes in the aged timber from frantic attempts to force entry, and tucked in the remotest section of the cellar, under a heap of worn-out coverings and decayed padding, lay an improvised shelter, discarded food tins, a grimy coverlet, and a jagged metal shard apparently crafted from the grating itself. Evidently, an intruder had been residing there. The duration remained a mystery. Carl Eugene Vickers was apprehended 6 days post-blizzard, roughly 40 miles northward from my land, battling intense frostbite and exposure. Reports indicated he'd been concealed in a deserted hunter's shack, insisting he'd stayed put since fleeing. Perhaps that's accurate. Perhaps another lost soul lurked in those woods that evening. Some frantic individual who discovered my cellar and labored for hours to breach the barrier while I waited upstairs, knife in hand. I repeat this to myself during those 3 a.m. awakenings, when sleep eludes me. I convince myself it wasn't him, merely a vagrant looking for refuge. That true peril never loomed. But Penny's fierce snarls at that air duct linger in my mind. So does the grating of steel on steel from the shadows underfoot. And those tracks in the snow encircling my dwelling thrice before halting at the cellar entrance with no trace of departure. Nowadays, I reside in a third-floor unit. No cellar, no loft, no underbelly spaces. Penny continues to curl up by my bed's edge, and in the wee hours, I sometimes notice her fixated on the warm air grill along the wall. In those moments, slumber evades me entirely. I remain motionless in the shadows, ears attuned, hoping against hope for silence to prevail. Blizzards in the Pacific Northwest occur infrequently, which explains the lack of readiness when one struck our area in early 2024. My community, a modest settlement just beyond Seattle, ground to a halt in mere hours. Educational institutions shuttered, shops barricaded, and within 48 hours, electricity failed across 3 districts. At 26, pursuing my nursing certification alongside a part-time role at a local animal hospital, I believed myself equipped for crises. My building complex anchors the close of Burwood Lane, adjacent to a handful of vintage homes dating back to the 1970s. Among them was the residence of Howard Freely, an 83-year-old bachelor who'd dwelt solo since his spouse's death 6 years prior. Over the 2 years I'd been there, Howard and I had forged a cordial pattern. I'd clear his path during cold snaps, and he'd repay with summer deliveries of fresh-picked tomatoes at my threshold. Witty and keen-minded, he often regaled me with tales from his stint as a municipal wireman. That Thursday morning, when my call to his fixed line went unanswered, I chalked it up to severed communications, matching the widespread outages. By midday, the mercury plunged to 19 degrees, with ice relentlessly accumulating. I layered up heavily, snatched my light and a flask of steaming brew, then navigated the iced-over lawn to his abode. A trek that normally spanned 2 minutes stretched into a cautious 10-minute glide over a glassy expanse. His dwelling appeared unlit, as did every structure nearby. Yet the absolute quietude unsettled me. No rising plume from the flue, no stirrings beyond the iced panes. I rapped on the entryway and paused, exhaling dense vapors into the biting chill. No response. I pounded firmer, shouting his name. After an interminable wait, faint scuffling emanated from within. Measured, purposeful steps neared the portal. The lock turned, and the panel edged open slightly, exposing a narrow glimpse of Howard's features in the muted light. His gaze, typically lively and etched with mirth, now seemed dulled and wary. He regarded me as though piecing together a vital recollection. At last, when words emerged, they were faint and hesitant. "What brought you to my door?" I chuckled initially, figuring he was pulling one of his usual pranks. "Howard, it's Nate. Your neighbor from the complex right next door. I brought some fresh coffee for you." I lifted the thermos as if it were solid evidence of who I was. He stayed put, not swinging the door open any further. That single eye of his kept darting over my features, hunting for recognition. The quiet dragged on, and the chill seeped right through my coat. At last, he eased the door back just enough for me to slip through, but there was no friendly word. He merely retreated into the shadowy corridor, his gaze fixed on me without blinking. The place felt like a freezer, probably no warmer than 50 degrees inside, and my breath hung in the air like fog. Howard had on a thick wool overcoat layered atop what seemed like a couple of sweaters, with a woolen hat tugged low nearly to his brows. He appeared diminished from how I recalled him, more breakable, as if the frost had withered him away. I inquired whether he was all right, if he had sufficient supplies of food and drink, and he merely dipped his head in a vague nod, offering no real reply. A lone kerosene lamp on the coffee table illuminated the living room, throwing elongated shadows onto the walls. Vintage photos covered every inch. Howard alongside his departed wife, Meredith, long-ago family events, washed-out pictures of unfamiliar faces. I placed the thermos aside and began to inform him that the utility folks estimated another 2 or 3 days before power returned to the neighborhood. Howard sank into his armchair, the worn leather groaning under his weight, observing me with that eerie composure. "You're no neighbor from those apartments," he declared abruptly, his tone sharpening. "I recognize the fellow from there. A youngster with specs who pilots a blue pickup." My stomach dropped, since that painted a perfect picture of me. I did sport glasses, and my vehicle was a weathered blue Ford I'd picked up second-hand 3 years back. I softly jogged his memory, mentioning our chat from just last week on the upcoming forecast. He denied it with a methodical shake of the head, as though I were feeding him a blatant falsehood. "No," he insisted. "That kid wouldn't barge in here feigning assistance. Folks like you bide your time for tempests such as this. You linger until the power fails, ensuring no one witnesses your schemes." I forced myself to remain composed, recalling that Howard was 83, isolated, likely parched and hunkered in an unheated home amid the outage. Stress often amplified bewilderment in the aged. I'd picked that up from my nursing courses. My words stayed gentle, and even as I assured him my only aim was his well-being, that I could stoke his hearth or escort him to my unit where a compact propane unit kept things tolerable. Howard's face hardened, his knuckles whitening on the chair's arms as if preparing for impact. "Stay put," he ordered, jabbing a frail finger my way. "Not a step." With visible strain, he rose from the seat and vanished into the rear passage of the dwelling. I lingered in the lamp's feeble radiance, the floorboards groaning under his retreating steps. A voice in my head urged me to bolt, to exit via the front and summon aid. But to whom? The streets were blocked solid, phone signals flickered at best. The closest station sat 12 miles off, across a sheet of ice. From the rear came the scrape of a drawer, followed by the distinct heavy snap of metal. Howard re-emerged holding a shotgun, an antique Remington with a polished wooden grip, decades of handling evident, and he cradled it against his torso, grip firm and assured. My muscles locked up tight. I lifted my hands deliberately, open-palmed, edging back toward the exit. "Howard, listen," I pleaded, fighting the quiver in my throat. "Nate here. 2 years we've been acquaintances. Last August, you handed over those massive heirloom tomatoes from your plot, remember? The weapon stayed level. Our stares held, and in the lamp's unsteady glow, I glimpsed a harrowing depth in his, not outright rage, but terror, profound, unhinged, all-devouring. "I see your game," he murmured. "Just like the rest, Crave. You figure my age, my solitude, makes me easy pickings to rob blind. Yet I've prepared for seasons now." The shotgun's muzzle inched toward my torso, and a nauseating realization hit. Escape wasn't as straightforward as strolling away. Beyond the panes, the gale howled fiercer, sleet drumming like scattered stones. The muted daylight filtering through the drapes dimmed further, and I knew full nightfall loomed within the hour. I mentally sifted my choices, one after another, all while regulating my breaths. Dashing for the threshold might provoke a shot. His grip on the weapon seemed solid, and up close like this, accuracy wasn't an issue. Attempting to talk sense into him could only escalate things, playing right into the grip of whatever madness had seized him. The chill in the room intensified noticeably, leaving my fingertips tingling with numbness. With a nod of the shotgun, Howard pointed toward the sofa along the distant wall. Quote, 17, he commanded. Quote, 18. I complied, easing myself down onto the chilly padding bit by bit. My gaze locked on the barrel the entire time. He stayed on his feet by the armchair, keeping the gun aimed squarely at me, and silence stretched between us for what felt like ages. The lantern's flame wavered, casting shifting shadows over his lined features. Desperately, I searched for any sign of the Howard I remembered, the fellow who'd given my truck a boost during last winter's freeze, who'd shared tales of constructing his home single-handedly in 1978. Quote 19. I ventured softly, striving to sound as soothing as possible. Quote 20. He blinked in my direction, and briefly a flash of bewilderment crossed his face, not the wild distrust, but honest puzzlement. Quote 21, he replied, his tone unsteady, as if doubting his own words. Quote 22. A pang hit me in the ribs at that mention. Meredith had passed away 6 years prior. I held back from setting him straight, fearing it might unleash something far uglier, but the picture sharpened for me then. Lack of fluids, the biting cold, days alone, each could erode an older mind on its own, but combined, they brewed a vicious mix of disorientation and fear. The man before me, shotgun in hand, wasn't inherently cruel or threatening, he was simply scared, trapped in a splintered world where his late wife still bustled about and intruders lurked to plunder him under cover of night. Grasping that truth didn't lessen the threat of the firearm or ease my peril. My plan was to keep the dialogue going, maintain his composure, and either disarm him somehow or slip out of the place before disaster struck. Shifting tactics, I chose not to press my identity, but to enter his illusion, aligning with where his thoughts had wandered. Quote, 23, I murmured deliberately, palms resting openly on my thighs. Quote 24. The tension in Howard's hold eased a touch, and he cocked his head, attentive. But that's not me. Just a concerned local, looking out for you. Meredith would have hoped for that kind of watchfulness, right? Her name stirred a change in his look. The sternness in his gaze melted, and briefly he appeared adrift, like a kid straining to recall a vital detail. Meredith frets excessively, he grumbled, mostly to himself. Constantly nagging me to stay alert, secure the locks. Keep the firearm ready. He dipped the muzzle a bit, directing it downward rather than at my torso. A faint glimmer of optimism stirred inside me. The lantern's wick popped, its glow flaring erratically before steadying. In that unsteady illumination, moisture gathered at the edges of Howard's eyes. She still isn't home, he uttered, voice breaking. Left for the store ages back. Roads are probably treacherous. I forced down a lump, pondering how to steer through this without crumbling his tenuous grip on things. One side of me itched to lay out the facts. That Meredith was long gone had been for years, that he clung to a faded echo of life. Yet I realized that revelation might shatter him utterly, propelling him into deeper peril. So I inclined my head kindly instead and offered, Yeah, the paths are awful out there, Howard. She's likely hunkered down someplace secure. Come morning after the weather clears, she'll return. He took it in stride, his frame sagging a little as strain seeped away, though the shotgun stayed in his grasp. He moved awkwardly to the pane, drawing aside the icy drape with one hand while gripping the Remington with the other. Beyond, everything lay blanketed in a thick layer of white and frosted gray, the heavens burdened with low clouds hinting at further onslaught. This whole mess sits wrong with me, he breathed. Me neither. My cell sat heavy in my pocket, but I'd glanced at it earlier. No bars, just 2% power left. Even a distress call wouldn't summon aid across that frozen barrier. The following hour dragged on in an eerie impasse. Howard blocked any exit, yet refused to set aside the gun. He lounged in his armchair, the Remington shotgun resting across his thighs, eyeing me with that familiar blend of wariness and bewilderment etched on his face. I remained on the sofa, keeping my hands in plain sight, chatting with him in measured, gentle words about everyday topics. The weather outside, goings-on in the area, anecdotes from the animal hospital where I was employed. Occasionally he'd reply, sharing snippets of recollections that skipped erratically through time. In one breath, he'd recount installing electrical in a home back in 1982. In the next, he'd inquire whether I'd spotted his daughter recently. I had no idea Howard even had a daughter. He'd never brought her up during the 2 years of our acquaintance. When I pressed for her name, he fell silent for what felt like ages before murmuring, Lorraine. The quiet way he uttered it hinted at a long estrangement untouched for years. By now, night had fully enveloped the outdoors. The panes were mere dark reflections of the faint kerosene light inside. The room's chill had plunged to the low 40s, turning each breath into a visible puff. I suggested building a fire in the hearth, but he jerked his head no, warning that the flue was clogged and we'd suffocate on fumes. By about 8 o'clock, exhaustion hit Howard like a wave. His lids drooped heavily, his head sagged forward, and the gun tilted awkwardly in his hold. I observed him intently, scarcely daring to inhale, poised for any chance to shift position. When his chin met his chest, I believed for an instant he'd dozed off fully. I leaned ahead on the seat, readying myself to rise and approach, then carefully retrieve the firearm from him. Yet as soon as I stirred, his gaze sharpened wide awake, the muzzle whipping back my way. "Don't!" he snapped, his tone abruptly crisp and aware. "I see through you, you're biding your time till I relax." My pulse thundered in my chest as I settled back against the pillows, palms up once more in submission. "I'm staying put, Howard. You have my word." He fixed on me steadily, dread resurfacing in his stare. Then his features softened into an expression bordering on sorrow. "I'm worn out," he confessed, his words cracking. "Exhausted from this constant fear. I can't even recall what scares me these days." Right then, I glimpsed his true self. Not a danger, but a fellow ensnared by his own unraveling thoughts, locked in a cage of disorientation and dread with no key in sight. I resolved to act in a way that risked everything, yet seemed utterly necessary. Rising gradually, with every gesture open and slow, I advanced toward him. He lifted the shotgun, index finger teasing the trigger, yet I pressed on. "What the hell?" he challenged, voice spiking with alarm. "Keep your distance," I continued, pulse racing fiercely up my neck until I stood mere inches away, so near that a shot would erase me entirely. Meeting those bewildered, scared, weary eyes, I murmured, "Howard, it's freezing. You're beat. You must not have had a bite in ages. I'll sit here with you now and we'll sort this out side by side. I'm not out to harm you or grab anything. Just your neighbor concerned about your well-being." For an agonizing stretch, he only gazed back. The Remington's end dug into my belly. I sensed its icy steel through my coat. Then his countenance eased, as if a shadow had lifted from the light, and he let the weapon drop. It thudded onto the boards between our feet, and sobs racked Howard fiercely, heaving his frame. I stayed by his side through the remainder of that frigid evening, offering him bits of crackers and sips from the water in his pantry, draping covers over us both to share body heat. His awareness ebbed and flowed. At times he addressed me correctly, at others by unfamiliar tags, perhaps his siblings or a buddy from long ago. Dawn brought relief as the gale subsided. Weak rays filtered past the frosted glass, accompanied by the far-off grind of a snowplow clearing the highway. I coaxed a faint phone signal and summoned help via ambulance. Upon the medic's arrival, Howard appeared serene, nearly content, oblivious to the hours he'd menaced me with the gun. At the medical center, they identified extreme fluid loss and incipient hypothermia, which had ignited a bout of delirium atop his emerging dementia, as specialists soon verified. His daughter Lorraine arrived from Ohio after 3 days. Though they'd been at odds for more than 10 years, the ordeal reunited them. That spring, Howard relocated to a care home. I'd stopped by to see him several times before he died the next winter. He had no recollection of that evening at all. He was oblivious to how nearly he'd ended my life or how tempted I was to bolt and abandon him in that icy home. I haven't forgotten, though. Every instant remains vivid in my mind. Even now, when the lights dim during a thunderstorm, I can still sense that icy barrel digging into my belly and catch echoes of his fractured tone, demanding to know who'd dispatched me there. Naomi, my wife, and I had tackled Crescent Peak around 30 times ever since settling in Colorado. The path was as familiar to us as the route to the bedroom in pitch darkness. Every path, every rock formation, every zigzag where the trees parted to reveal the valley stretching out beneath. We'd explored it in spring amid bursts of wildflowers blanketing the fields, in autumn as the aspens painted the slopes in shimmering gold, and even in winter when snow draped the landscape like a hushed sanctuary of white and shadow. By 2024, with 6 years of marriage behind us and endless weekends scaling that peak, we felt confident enough for a February outing. The weather report promised sunny conditions until dusk, temps around 20 degrees, and calm winds. We loaded up our standard cold weather kit, hand warmers, additional clothing, space blankets, energy bars, and parked at the well-known trailhead lot at about 9 a.m., aiming for the top by midday and descending before 3 p.m. The initial 2 hours unfolded flawlessly. As usual, Naomi led the way, her vivid red coat standing out sharply against the drifts, her exhales forming small misty puffs that shimmered in the dawn glow. We chatted about everyday stuff, her siblings' impending baby, the persistent basement drip we'd been ignoring, and if it was time to adopt a pet with our new spacious yard. The route was well trodden by prior visitors, simple to trace, and we crossed paths with a couple of descending folks who waved and raved about the stunning panoramas up high that day. A profound satisfaction washed over me then, the kind that whispers everything's in perfect order. At one turn, Naomi glanced back with a grin, her face flushed from the chill, and I marveled at my fortune that she truly relished these treks, rather than just enduring them to please me. We paused at our go-to ledge, a smooth stone above a iced-over stream, to sip water and split a snack bar. It was roughly 11:15, the heavens a flawless azure without a hint of clouds. The shift hit so abruptly that I still question if it unfolded that way. We were basking in sunlight one instant. The next, a sharp chill descended, as if a refrigerator had swung wide, and a murky barrier surged across the crest overhead. I'd witnessed fast-approaching fronts in the past, but this was unmatched. In under 10 minutes, the clear expanse turned to total gloom, with initial flakes drifting down softly, almost enchanting, like the flurries in holiday films. Naomi chuckled and tilted her head to snag one on her tongue, while I fished out my cell for any fresh alerts. No bars, typical at that height. But the earlier forecast had indicated no threats until well past midnight. We opted to forego the peak and retreat, betting we could beat the front. That choice likely spared me, even if it nearly claimed Naomi. By the granite bend, where the path looped around a huge rock face, sight lines had shrunk to about 50 feet. The precipitation had shifted from gentle to ferocious, whipping horizontally on gales that sliced through my insulation like knives. My lids stung shut against the assault, and the ground ahead vanished beneath new powder. Naomi remained just ahead, though her coat blurred into obscurity, forcing me to yell for her to catch my words over the roar. We halted to don protective eyewear and seal our outfits, huddling side by side with faces averted from the blasts. Her expression sticks with me, not outright fear, but a focused intensity she seldom displayed. She clasped my fingers and insisted we stick together, never more than an arm's reach away. I agreed, fully aware she had the right idea. We pressed on, pace deliberate, attempting to stick to the presumed route. That was our initial error. Amid a total whiteout, your mind fabricates paths from the void. I'm not sure precisely when we drifted apart. That's the detail that torments me above all. The inability to fix the exact instant she vanished. Our grips were linked, then suddenly not, and I figured she'd edged forward as she often would. I trudged onward, gaze lowered into the gale, pursuing what I believed to be her tracks. But in such a blizzard, new layers erase impressions almost immediately. I was likely chasing mere illusions, dips in the snow, fleeting shadows, and my frantic, wishful thinking. Her name escaped my lips, but the gale snatched it away after just a short distance. Halting, I spun around completely, yelling, "Naomi!" repeatedly. In all directions stretched nothing but white, no glimpse of her red jacket, no stir of life, no echo back. Only this relentless, twisting, oppressive whiteness closing in from everywhere. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone. 0 bars, battery clinging to 62%, and the freezing air was sapping it quickly. Perhaps a couple of hours left before it gave out entirely. The logical side of my mind urged me to remain in place. All those survival tips, every piece I'd skimmed about vanishing in the wild, hammered home the identical advice. Don't budge. Hold your position. Wait for searchers to locate you. Yet Naomi was somewhere in that mess, maybe veering off course, maybe injured. The idea of freezing in one spot as she vanished into the blizzard was too agonizing to contemplate. I reached a choice I'd question forever after. I resolved to backtrack and locate her. Trouble was, I couldn't tell which way I'd originally come. It all blended together seamlessly. I chose a path that intuitively felt correct, one that dipped gently like the trail ought to, and pressed on. Every few moments I'd pause to bellow her name, straining for any reply, met only by the howl of wind. I trudged what seemed like 20 or 30 minutes. Gradually, it dawned on me that the surroundings bore no resemblance to the path I recalled. The trees stood denser, more ancient, their limbs sagging low under heavy snow loads. No blazes on the trunks, no footprints, no evidence of prior human passage. Then I tripped into the open space and things deteriorated sharply. Initially, I mistook it for a roadway, perhaps a service route that could guide me toward safety. The expanse lay even and broad, slicing straight through the woods, sparking a rush of optimism that nearly brought tears. But continuing ahead, I saw it wasn't a proper road. Instead, it was a skid trail, the kind loggers etch into the woods to haul away chopped timber. Devastation ringed it. Tree stumps jutted from the drifts like decayed molars, some newly sawn with raw wood exposed, others weathered gray and cracked by seasons. Massive equipment had churned the earth into icy furrows and bumps, half buried by snow, yielding a barren, otherworldly vista. The paths splintered and intersected chaotically, defying any logic I could grasp. I'd never spotted this zone on a chart. No one had ever brought up timber work on this mountain flank. I'd ended up in forbidden territory, a place clashing with the landscape I'd committed to memory across 6 years of treks. I attempted to get my bearings from the scant visible details. The blizzard had eased a touch, not ended, but lightened, so forms emerged perhaps 100 feet off rather than 50. Still, nothing offered helpful clues. Peaks loomed all around, shrouded in clouds. They appeared uniform, mere snowy inclines fading into murky heavens. I checked my phone once more, craving a single signal bar, but nada. Now, at 41%. My mind turned to Naomi, how she had to be hunting for me as well, likely repeating my errors, drifting ever farther from our split point. She'd returned to the vehicle and summoned aid. Rescuers would comb the usual route, our standard hike. No one would consider probing this nameless woodland stretch. And should they venture here later, it wouldn't happen before morning at best. Meanwhile, the night promised a plunge to 15 below zero. I understood the calculations. I grasped the implications. Without refuge or a return path, hypothermia would strike within hours after dark. Forcing myself to halt and deliberate properly rather than mere instinct, I fought back the fear. Panic rivaled the chill as the real threat. A lesson from my dad surfaced, from a boyhood hunt in Wyoming when we'd lost our way. Water runs downward, and folks settle by water sources. Spot a brook or rivulet, trail it downhill off the slope, and it'd eventually deliver me someplace. The logging site demanded an entry route for vehicles, linking ultimately to a main thoroughfare. Shutting my eyes, I tuned out the gusts, seeking any hint of flowing liquid. Zilch. The silence reigned, broken solely by the whisper of flakes and the groan of iced limbs. I chose the logging path that appeared to slope steadily downward and began trudging along it, tallying my footsteps to distract my thoughts from the increasing chill settling into my toes. 100 steps, 200, 300. The route twisted and branched, so I veered left since it continued descending. 400, 500. My feet grew awkward, as if they weren't mine anymore, forcing me to focus intently on every lift to ensure they cleared the drifts properly. Dusk was closing in when I spotted the stream. I nearly overlooked it, a faint shadow slicing the snowscape, obscured by frost and powder. Yet the faint murmur of liquid flowing underneath halted me for a better inspection. Since it was moving, it must lead someplace, and any direction beat standing still. I pivoted to trail it downstream, hugging the edge without getting too near, aware that the drifts might conceal fragile ice patches. The chill intensified rapidly. I sensed the bite in the atmosphere, sharper than before, with my exhales forming dense puffs that iced over my facial hair and collar. I glanced at my cell once again. 23%. Signal absent. Snapping a photo of the waterway ahead, I figured if rescuers discovered my remains, they'd at least see my route. That's when the reality sank in deep. The chance I could perish here wasn't vague anymore, but a pressing threat unfolding soon. My mind wandered to Naomi, wondering if she'd reached the vehicle, if she was cozy and secure, summoning aid, or if she too was wandering this icy labyrinth, equally disoriented and terrified. I stuck with that stream for what amounted to 2 meters, though time stretched it to feel like 20. The margins were irregular, choked with hidden shrubs under the white blanket, compelling me to scramble across toppled timber and shove past limbs that snagged my coat like insistent fingers. The frost had advanced beyond my soles, infiltrating my calves with a persistent throb that turned each stride more laborious. To confirm I could still speak, I muttered aloud to myself, belting tune verses, rattling off colleagues' names from work, imagining my homecoming meal, whatever it took to sharpen my wits against the haze, signaling advancing hypothermia. The waterway broadened further along, merging with minor feeds, which I viewed optimistically. Larger flows suggested proximity to the valley base, nearer to human presence. Then, as twilight bled into night, a sight nearly buckled my knees amid the powder. A barrier. An aged, battered timber fence paralleling the opposite bank. Boundaries implied land ownership. Ownership hinted at inhabitants. Inhabitants promised rescue. I forded the stream at a shallow gap where stones pierced the flow, drenching my footwear in the frigid current, indifferent since reaching that barrier overrode all else. Beyond it lay a trail. Not a wild footpath, but a clear track etched by boots and perhaps tires, veering from the water amid skeletal poplars. I pursued it on waning reserves, limbs propelled by sheer resolve. My fingers had lost all sensation. The way bent around an embankment revealing golden glows, inviting, radiant, from a modest shack perhaps 300 yards distant. I attempted a sprint, but my form rebelled. Instead, I hurried in a hobble, flailing my arms despite the empty outdoors. At the veranda, I hammered the entrance with unresponsive knuckles. When an elderly fellow swung it open, rifle clutched and wariness etched on his features, my voice faltered. "Lost," I managed. "Wife still missing? Need help?" He studied me steadily, then dropped the weapon and drew me in. The blaze from his fireplace slammed into me like a barrier. He bundled me in covers and pressed a steaming mug into my grasp. I can't recall its contents, and dialed authorities on his fixed line while I trembled uncontrollably, scarcely gripping the vessel. The ensuing hours blurred into chatter, crackling transmissions, and beams piercing the gloom. The gentleman, Howard as I later discovered, had resided on that peak for 40 years, intimately familiar with its every corner, logging routes included. From my account, he directed the team to my origin point, prompting them to adjust their patrol zones accordingly. I ached to join the hunt for Naomi, to scour the wilds myself, but my body heat was critically depleted, barring me from the hut. A medical responder remained by my side, checking my vital signs and gradually warming me with warm blankets and intravenous fluids. Each passing minute dragged on endlessly. My mind raced with worries about the freezing temperatures outside. How they must have plunged below zero, and how Naomi's smaller frame would lose heat even quicker. I found myself pleading with a higher power I wasn't entirely convinced existed, vowing commitments I intended to honor if only she emerged unscathed. Just before 9:30, static burst from the radio, silencing the entire room. Rescuers had located a person, a woman in a red jacket, alert yet suffering from hypothermia. They were heading back with her. Naomi had handled the crisis perfectly. Upon realizing we'd become separated, she halted her movement right away and sought cover. She curled up in a slight hollow under a rocky ledge, scarcely large enough for her, but sufficient to shield against the gusts. Using the emergency blanket from her backpack, the metallic silver one, she bundled herself tightly and endured nearly 5 hours there, preserving her strength, confident that I'd summon aid and they'd return for her. The search party spotted her thanks to that gleaming blanket. A rescuer's headlamp caught a glint of the reflection, prompting a closer look. She suffered minor frostbite on 3 fingers and moderate hypothermia. Yet she was very much alive. They transported her to the cabin, where I anxiously waited. The moment she stepped inside, ashen-faced and drained, her lips faintly tinged blue, I enveloped her in an embrace so fierce I wondered if I'd ever release her. Words escaped us for quite a while. They weren't necessary. Howard lingered in the corner of his kitchen, observing silently. Later, he shared that over 4 decades on that peak, he'd witnessed countless wanderers vanish, not all returning. We were fortunate, he noted. Foolish, yet fortunate. I couldn't dispute a word. Naomi and I continue our hikes to this day. The next summer, we revisited Crescent Peak, pausing at the separation point to analyze our misstep. The explanation was straightforward and sobering. We'd overrated our skills and underrated the mountain's dangers. The sudden squall that struck was eventually identified as a microburst, a brief, concentrated storm that arose and vanished in hours, far too swift and confined for local weather reports to predict. It boiled down to sheer misfortune, the sort that strikes anyone, regardless of their precautions. Still, misfortune doesn't justify poor choices. And I'd committed several once the gale intensified. I ought to have remained stationary after losing sight of Naomi. I should have relied on her sound judgment, which she demonstrated, and recognized that wandering aimlessly would only compound the peril. Instead, panic eclipsed reason, nearly dooming us both. Nowadays, we trek equipped with GPS devices, emergency beacons, satellite messengers, and an ironclad agreement. If separation occurs again, we freeze in place and await rescue. We scrutinize weather predictions relentlessly and inform at least 3 contacts of our precise itinerary beforehand. Howard died last year. Spotting his obituary in the community newspaper, I motored up to his land to honor him. In the sunlight, the cabin appeared diminished, unremarkable, a simple timber shelter perched on the slope. To me, though, it'll forever symbolize rebirth. The site where an unfamiliar man, armed with a rifle and a phone line, preserved my existence and our bond. I placed a whiskey bottle on his porch, attached to a message reading, "Thank you," even though I realized nobody would see it. Certain obligations defy full settlement. You bear them onward, striving to merit the fresh start bestowed upon you. It was Saturday evening, December 24th, 2022, and my wife Denise had spent weeks orchestrating our intimate family celebration. We'd settled into our home on Burwood Lane merely 8 months prior, a humble 2-level dwelling in a serene suburb beyond Richmond, Virginia. My folks arrived from North Carolina, while Denise's sibling Maggie traveled with her spouse Owen and their pair of children, joining our own girl Sophie, freshly 4 years old. That made 9 souls crammed into a space that abruptly seemed cozier than anticipated. By 7 p.m., the kitchen wafted aromas of honey-glazed ham and my mom's renowned sweet potato dish, as Sophie dashed loops around the holiday tree alongside her cousins, their giggles echoing throughout the rooms. Finishing college in 2008 amid the economic downturn, it had required 14 years for me to secure a property suitable for hosting seasonal feasts. That evening seemed validation that the hardships had paid off. The initial rap at the door sounded near 8 o'clock, precisely as we gathered the emptied meal dishes, with Owen, my father-in-law, midway through one of his rambling tales of a botched angling excursion. I halted in my tracks, plates balanced in my grasp, assuming perhaps a local had dropped in for seasonal greetings. During the summer, we'd encountered a handful of the neighbors, mainly elderly pairs who stayed pretty much to their own business, but came across as pleasant enough. From the dining area, Denise locked eyes with me and gave a little shrug, so I placed the plates on the counter and made my way to the entrance. The outdoor lamp illuminated the space, sending a warm amber light filtering through the opaque glass beside the entrance. Shadows loomed outside, suggesting multiple figures frozen in place against the chilly evening darkness. Their unmoving, silent presence caused me to hesitate just before grasping the knob. I cracked the door open part way, positioning myself to shield the cozy interior from the chill. 4 strangers occupied the steps, 3 guys and a lady, all underdressed for the dropping temperatures. One fellow sported a lightweight denim coat layered over plaid flannel, while the woman wore a sweatshirt with cuffs rolled up, even though it hovered in the upper 20s. Their ages spanned from perhaps early 20s up to mid-50s, and none appeared connected by blood or familiarity. The eldest, a stocky fellow sporting an uneven salt and pepper beard and sunken eyes that gleamed eerily under the light, almost amber-like, advanced and offered a grin. He explained they knew Owen, that he'd extended an invitation for after-dinner treats, and he expressed regret for the surprise visit. Glancing toward the dining space, I shouted for Owen to confirm if he anticipated guests. He emerged from the corridor, brow furrowed in bewilderment, denying any such plans with a gradual headshake. Pivoting back to the visitors, their explanation shifted once more. The lady, featuring limp golden locks and a fidgety tick of scratching at her cuticles, claimed instead they were acquaintances of Maggie through her congregation. I asked her to wait and fetched Maggie, who arrived at the threshold dabbing her hands with a kitchen cloth. She gazed at the unfamiliar quartet with utter blankness, insisting she'd never laid eyes on them and that she wasn't part of any religious circle. The youngest man, a lanky youth marked by pockmarks and a bald pate, chuckled uneasily, suggesting a possible error in directions. Wrong address, perhaps. Yet he lingered, as did the rest, rooted on the stoop with vapors from their breaths clouding the frigid air, their gazes carrying an undercurrent of deliberate scrutiny beneath the courteous facade. The burly man inquired if they might step in briefly to thaw out while sorting their whereabouts. But every fiber of my being urged rejection. Politely, I declined, noting our intimate family gathering precluded admitting unknowns. My tone emerged steadier than anticipated, and I caught a fleeting glint in the stocky man's stare, a momentary clench of his lips that vanished in an instant. With an exaggerated nod, he acknowledged my stance, insisting no offense taken. Directing a subtle flick of his fingers toward his companions, he signaled departure. Wordlessly, they descended the steps and crossed the lawn. Peering through the misty pane, I observed them hit the pavement, anticipating a vehicle on the curb, but they diverged instead. The woman paired with the bald youth veered left, slipping beyond the adjacent property's barrier, whereas the robust leader and the silent, lean man in his 40s headed right, melting into the dim gaps between lamps. I secured the door with a click, pausing to reassure myself all was well. Owen queried the odd encounter, and I admitted ignorance, likely just lost folks with a bad address. Deep down, though, doubt lingered. Their approach felt scripted, their dispersal too orchestrated after my rebuff. Denise joined me, inquiring about the situation, and I mustered a grin, dismissing it as trivial. In the den, Dad assisted the children in stacking a column from discarded gift-wrap rolls, while Mom portioned out pie in the kitchen. Momentarily, the festive bustle and cheer drew me back in. I double-checked the entrance latch almost absent-mindedly before aiding Mom in transporting the sweets to the table. That's when the rear entrance knob jiggled, a methodical, purposeful noise slicing through the merriment sharper than a blade through cloth. I banged the plates onto the table with such force that one shattered against the surface, then headed straight for the kitchen in silence. The back door featured a window in its upper section, draped with a flimsy curtain Denise had installed when we first settled in, and through the sheer material, I spotted a figure lurking right outside. The person didn't bother knocking or shouting. They simply jiggled the handle repeatedly, seemingly checking if the lock would give way. As I approached the door, I pulled the curtain back sharply and came face to face with the woman sporting that limp blonde hair. She pressed so near the glass that her breathing created a foggy patch on it. Our gazes locked, yet she didn't retreat or appear startled. Instead, she flashed a broad, vacant grin, revealing an excess of teeth. Then she released the handle and retreated a single step into the shadowy expanse of our yard. From behind me, Owen's voice rose, inquiring about the situation. I also caught Denise instructing the children to remain in the living room, her tone straining to convey composure. Snatching my phone off the counter, I punched in 911, my digits flying ahead of my racing mind. The operator picked up, and I explained that intruders were encircling our home. They'd attempted the front entrance and were now probing the rear, while my whole family, including 3 young kids, was inside. She requested the address, which I provided, and assured me that patrols were en route, urging me to remain connected. Owen had inspected the dining room windows and returned to report, spotting a silhouette creeping along the house's side, hugging the wall in the thickest gloom. My dad emerged in the kitchen entrance, gripping a carving knife from the meal's setup, his complexion ashen but his expression resolute, and he demanded to know their numbers. "At least 4, I replied. He gave a single nod and stationed himself by the back entrance. The operator's queries came at me in a haze I could hardly grasp. Meanwhile, from the living room, Sophie's voice piped up, questioning her mom about the fear etched on everyone's faces. The ensuing moments dragged on like an eternity all our own. We herded the group into the living room, distant from the glass, where Denise settled on the rug with the three little ones, reciting a tale from one of Sophie's fresh holiday reads, her delivery holding steady with minimal quiver. My mom positioned herself nearby, her palm gently on my girl's spine, her mouth forming what seemed like a quiet invocation. Owen, my father, and I claimed spots to monitor the primary doors and panes, while Maggie lingered by the corridor, phone in hand, capturing footage of the front lawn via a slit in the drapes. The operator's words provided a reliable tether amid the turmoil, updating that help was 7 minutes away, then 5, then 3. I braced for the shatter of breaking panes or one of those unknowns bursting inward. Yet the outdoors offered only quiet, a heavy, suffocating hush that somehow felt more menacing than any racket. They lingered beyond, I was certain, prowling the perimeter like predators, eyeing a weak spot in the barrier. At 9:14, strobing crimson and azure lights bathed my living room walls. No sensation of ease has ever washed over me quite like that. 2 squad cars rolled to the curb, and I peered out to see 4 cops exiting, torches at the ready. I informed the operator of their arrival. She permitted me to disconnect. Proceeding to the front entry, I swung it open to greet the lead officer on the stoop. He stood tall with a bald pate and a composed air, requesting a rundown of events as his colleague commenced circling the property, his light slicing the night. I recounted it all. The initial rap, the shifting tails, their dispersal, the lady at the rear. And he absorbed it all without pause, jotting notes and nodding from time to time. His teammate rounded the corner, reporting the yard empty, the back clear, no evidence of tampering at doors or frames. They examined the lateral gate, the garage, even peered behind the storage for yard tools, uncovering merely imprints in the frosted turf, 4 separate trails from the back door to the boundary, then vanishing onto the adjacent lot. The police gathered accounts from each of us, and Maggie displayed her clip, although the gloom obscured details beyond vague forms shifting outside. An officer, a lady sporting cropped gray hair after scouting the block, returned and shared that a resident 3 doors away had noticed an unfamiliar white van stationed at the street's far end earlier that night. She'd seen it while walking her dog at 7 p.m., but it had disappeared by the arrival of the squad cars. The police swapped a glance that set me on edge, one implying they'd encountered reports like this before. One of them brought up a wave of residential break-ins across the county in recent months, all aimed at homes during family get-togethers when folks were occupied and entrances potentially unsecured. He pointed out how fortunate we were not to have invited them inside and to report it swiftly. That's likely what kept us safe. He avoided mentioning the fates of households less cautious, and I chose not to probe. We lodged an official report, received a case ID, and the team assured extra rounds in the vicinity for the coming weeks. With them gone, the festive spirit evaporated entirely. My parents chose to remain overnight rather than head home, while Owen and Maggie settled their children into Sophie's bedroom. The grown-ups gathered in the brightly lit den, verifying all locks twice over. None of us managed more than a couple hours of rest that night. Each floorboard groan or breeze rattling the panes jolted my pulse afresh. Her features, smooshed against the pane, lingered in my mind, that vacant grin conveying only calculated resolve. Authorities never located the suspects, never named them, never brought charges. Roughly a month afterward, I spotted a story in the community rag about a household in Henrio County getting robbed at gunpoint come New Year's Day. 4 perpetrators who'd bluffed their entry by pretending to be disoriented and requesting a phone. I pored over the account for ages, speculating if it involved the identical group. Mulling over the nightmare that might have unfolded had I swung the door open a fraction more. The winter when I signed on for those overnight hours at the modest round-the-clock market struck me as a decision driven by sheer obstinacy, not pressing need. Back then, I was handling daytime courses at the local junior college and scraping together funds to ditch the place I rented with my relative. Graveyard shifts offered serenity, reliability, and frankly, a pause from the day's turmoil. On that specific evening, the biting frost outdoors only registered when nearing the entrance panes. Rime clung to the borders as though the surface was contracting in the chill. I recall wandering the rows near 1 a.m., tidying displays that were already in order, merely battling sleepiness as the furnace hummed its familiar stuttering rhythm through the harsh cold snap. Though we operated non-stop, our supervisor required securing the entrances from 2 to 3 a.m. to replenish inventory without risk. I despised that window. Shoppers would spot the illumination and approach anyway, forcing me to signal "shut" mutely against the barrier like a fool. That shift, right after dumping a garbage sack, came the crisp raps on the main glass. Subtle, yet insistent and irregular. A fellow lingered outside in a lightweight pullover, crusted over with ice till it seemed rigid. Strands of hair clung to his brow, and his features bore a drawn, raw urgency, as if the freeze had stripped bare all but raw need. He formed silent words, then tapped anew, more rapidly. Approaching the entrance with arms folded against my body, the draft leaking through the edges, I hadn't uttered a word before he flattened his hand to the surface and called out, "Quote 45. His tone carried a shaky plea that tugged at my better instincts. Yet guidelines were ironclad, and we'd been drilled never to unfasten for anyone. Softly shaking my head, I kept my reply even via the external intercom, stating I wasn't permitted to release the latch. His demeanor altered. Not outright fury, but a clench in his features, as though my denial had triggered some inner fracture. I eased away a step, figuring he'd depart, but his stare drifted beyond my back toward the interior. Glancing over my shoulder, I caught sight of a companion positioned out in the flurry, a good distance removed, clad in a somber jacket with fists buried in his pockets. No signs of unease, no tremors from the weather, no effort to draw nearer. He remained rooted, countenance veiled by the building's eave. The initial stranger glanced between his partner and me, then edged forward once more, rapping with greater force, the impacts reverberating across the deserted space. I retreated even further, and the instant I did, the pair split apart in different directions, as if they'd rehearsed the move perfectly. They made their way to the side exits, yanking on every latch in sight. Their movements carried this eerie synchronicity without a single word between them or any shouts, just methodically trying handle after handle, like they had the building's blueprint memorized. I dashed behind the counter and slapped the security lock switch, though I doubted it offered more than a fleeting sense of cover. From the side window, I watched the first guy wrenching at the metal grip with such force that the entire panel shook. The other moved at a leisurely pace, scuffing his boots along a deliberate track in the snow, resembling someone retracing a familiar route. With each failed entry, the shop seemed to shrink around me. Noises amplified in the quiet. Every door's jangle, every scrape along the outer wall. I dialed the night supervisor, but it rang through to voicemail, and the dead air after the tone knotted my stomach. I dropped low behind the counter, glancing out through the lower glass pane, praying they'd lose interest. But then came the crunch of footsteps in the snow by the rear loading zone. One had circled to the back, possibly both. From my spot, I couldn't spot them. Just the dim blue glow of headlights from a vehicle at the lot's distant edge. Its hatch yawned open, the dome light stuttering intermittently, like a bulb on its last legs. Oddly, I hadn't spotted the car before, since the parking area was typically deserted that late. That gaping trunk twisted my gut in an inexplicable way, as though I was facing a puzzle whose solution I'd rather avoid. When I rose just high enough to peer out the front again, the initial man emerged, now perilously near the window. His exhales clouded the pane in ragged patches. No more tapping. He was fixed on the interior, eyes sweeping the shelves in back of me, gauging the distance to navigate them. I didn't drop down fast enough before he gave the entrance another vicious pull, his fingers blanching from the pressure. Abruptly, he shifted position, and the second figure appeared from the other side. They shared a glance, not quite a signal, more an unspoken verification, then both strode quickly toward the rear once more. I snatched the store's landline and dialed emergency services, murmuring details since my words sounded deafening in the vacant space. The operator pressed for specifics, but I could only recount the duo prowling the perimeter and the car's exposed cargo area. Midway through, a harsh metallic bang echoed from the back entrance, then repeated. Rhythmic, intentional blows. I relayed it to her, and she assured me a unit was en route, though the nearest was still minutes out. I flattened my palm under the counter to steady myself against the urge to pace, weighing whether to slip into the stockroom or remain visible to the surveillance feed. As I hesitated, the pounding ceased, giving way to a prolonged scraping noise, like hauling a bulky object over frozen ground by the rear access. The drag inched along the store's back side, halting briefly now and then, as if they were aligning something or probing for weak spots. I remained huddled, breath shallow, straining to hear past the drone of the old freezer nearby. Suddenly, the exterior floods on that flank blazed to life, flooding the snow with stark white light. In the sudden glare, I caught sight of them at the lot's bend, away from the doors now, clustered by their vehicle. The first paced a small loop, chafing his arms, as if prepping for action, while the other loomed still by the yawning trunk. Their routine screamed calculation, a pattern I wasn't supposed to decipher. The beams snapped off, returning the scene to that cold, indigo night. I shrank from view, pulse racing at the thought they'd spotted me. Moments later, fresh crunches of boots neared the main entrance, but just one pair. I ventured a quick peek over the counter's edge. There stood the first man, pressed to the glass, his breaths smearing wild streaks. His expression had shifted, charged with anticipation, like he sensed a shift in the odds. He formed a visor with his hands over his eyes and methodically surveyed the aisles, patient in a way that chilled me. No raps, no calls, just lingering. As I started to withdraw, beams from approaching lights sliced the lot, piercing the icy panes. A squad car eased in, its tires grinding over the compacted frost. When he spotted it, the guy by the entrance snapped his gaze toward the parking area, then dashed straight to the vehicle with its trunk gaping open. His companion banged the lid closed with a forceful slam, and both leaped into their ride before the cop could even exit his cruiser. The motor roared to life, tires skidding wildly as they peeled out of the lot and vanished along the street, kicking up flurries in their frantic escape. The squad car gave chase but couldn't grip the icy surface, handing them a crucial head start, plenty of time to melt into the night. Eventually, the patrolman entered the structure to inspect it, confirming that all entrances remained secure. He toured the premises alongside me, his beam sweeping over the rear exterior and the iced-over ground. Yet there were no obvious traces of what they'd hauled or shifted, just vague smudges in the drifts where the earth appeared churned up. The yawning trunk, their looping path around the building, the wordless teamwork, it all defied logic. He lingered on duty right up to dawn, but those figures didn't return, and the vague details I shared about their wheels led nowhere. To this day, I ponder what might have unfolded had I twisted that lock open. Whether the tale would have concluded stuffed in that baggage compartment rather than hunkered down at the register, clinging to assistance that arrived just in the nick of time. What began as a calm night morphed into one of those relentless winter blasts that materialize without warning, despite the weather report mentioning only light sprinkles. I'd wrapped up a brief advisory gig in a sleepy village about 2 hours from home, navigating a desolate country lane that rarely hosted any vehicles even in fair conditions. Back then, my schedule stayed straightforward. Snag any independent gigs that popped up, log serious mileage, and race the elements to reach my doorstep. That particular evening, flakes tumbled so densely they mimicked fuzz on a faulty television, while gusts nudged my sedan enough to demand a firmer hold on the steering. As I hit a constricted section flanked by overhanging branches that formed a shadowy corridor, my rubber hit an unseen glaze of frost. The automobile fishtailed, veered broadside, and wedged itself into a tilted bank of hardened soil. The motor hummed on, but the tires whirred pointlessly. I paused there briefly, the steady tap of limbs against the top echoing in my ears. Weighing whether to summon aid or ride out the mess, my cell's bars wavered from a single to zilch, and chill was already creeping past the seals on the panels. The gale wrapped the surroundings in an eerie hush, as if the landscape beyond lay muffled under layers of padding. I peered repeatedly into the back mirror, wishing for approaching lights, even though no beams had pierced the gloom for close to 30 minutes. That route wasn't one folks picked voluntarily, save for locals or those without alternatives. I promised myself one final attempt to jiggle loose before surrendering. Still, the wheels only churned, flinging powder rearward. A ball of irritation tightened in my gut, blended with the sobering truth that my isolation out there surpassed what I'd bargained for. So the abrupt flare of illumination trailing me struck like a godsend. It negotiated the curve at a measured pace, rays slicing the heavy veil of white until a truck lumbered into sight. Its growl boomed stronger than expected, halting nearer to my rear than typical in such foul conditions. At first, pure gratitude washed over me. I kept musing, at last, another soul on this stretch. Maybe with chains or a solid connection to summon proper recovery. Prior to exiting my own ride, a pair emerged from the cab, their forms backlit by the glare. Each sported high-vis jackets, like those worn by maintenance teams or aid groups. One gestured toward me with brisk, confident sweeps, as if this rescue routine was second nature. The view softened my nerves slightly, prompting me to crack my door and poke my head out for a chat. The lead fellow advanced at an even stride, his footwear grinding through the powder with deliberate, weighted steps. In person, he seemed late 30s, neatly groomed with a firm chin and a tone that cut through the howl without effort. He explained they were community helpers who scanned back roads in bad weather, assisting those caught out. His buddy lingered initially by the bed's edge, palms buried in his gear. Their teamwork struck me as scripted, yet amateurish, like amateurs aping a script they'd memorized but never enacted for real. My attention shifted to the jackets, and that's when the initial twinge of doubt hit. The designs clashed. One featured bold horizontal bands in vivid orange, the other slim slanted lines in faded gold. These strangers didn't belong to any roadside crew I'd encountered before, and the truck trailing them bore no logos or signs, not even a temporary sticker. My initial ease evaporated quickly. The guy nearest to me bent forward a bit, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as though divulging a confidential tip meant only for us. He mentioned how the freezing temps could hit someone hard during gales like this, urging me to hop into their rig for some real warmth while they sorted out unsticking my vehicle. His words carried that artificial steadiness folks adopt to nudge others into decisions without seeming pushy. I assured him I was okay right there, since my defroster was holding up. His face stayed mostly neutral, yet his stance stiffened subtly, like my refusal caught him off guard. Meanwhile, his companion started strolling methodically toward the rear of my ride, his strides careful and intentional. I couldn't make out his features well, just the faint glow from my taillights bouncing off the damp surface of his reflective jacket. But his actions screamed calculated intent, far too focused for mere good Samaritans. I hovered with one foot planted on the ground, the other still braced inside, caught between courtesy and that instinctive warning bell that rings when things start veering off course. Flurries dusted the nearer man's lashes, clinging as he pressed on, now emphasizing how their cab offered superior heating to mine. He tacked on that lingering solo in such conditions was risky. The delivery sent a chill racing up my skin. I peered beyond him at their ride, anticipating tools like plows, ropes, or flares. Instead, the cargo area sat barren. No de-icer, no cables. Merely a weathered blue ice chest and a pristine sheet of canvas that stood out against the vehicle's grime. That odd mismatch gnawed at me more than I'd care to confess. Then the initial fellow eased his fingers into his coat pocket, slow and unhurried, as if prepping an item discreetly without drawing eyes. The gesture was understated, nearly offhand, yet it radiated menace. My lungs tightened as every gut feeling yelled to stay alert. Simultaneously, his buddy had advanced past my rear bumper, vanishing from the mirror's edge to plant himself squarely at the tail end, sealing off any backward escape. Only then did it dawn on me how cornered I'd gotten. The blizzard raged onward, dampening noises and compressing the surroundings, turning our spot into a confined, swirling dome of white. Striving for composure in my tone, I insisted I only required a shove, not transport, and claimed backup was en route. A fib, but I hoped it'd alter the vibe. The closer man withdrew his hand from the pocket, concealing whatever it held beneath his cuff, and inched nearer, shrinking our buffer. His associate rapped the rear twice, with force enough to rock the chassis, ensuring I clocked his position. The discomfort had sharpened into outright dread, squeezing my chest like a vice. All the cozy air from my vents now seemed pointless. It hit me plainly. They weren't rescuers, and their scheme wouldn't let me roll out unscathed. As the pair converged from opposite sides, I saw the error in straddling the threshold. I yanked my leg aboard and sealed the door, decisively, though not with a bang, loud enough to cut through the gusts. The front man instantly grasped the latch, yanking once, as if counting on it yielding. When it held fast, he pressed to the glass and muttered that I was complicating matters unnecessarily. His timbre sank to a private growl, aimed solely at me amid the howl. I stayed silent, just fumbling for the central lock switch. The click was faint against the tempest, but it transformed his look instantly. The facade of aid vanished. I shifted into drive, aware the rubber would merely churn. The motor revved futilely as the treads slipped on the glaze. The fellow at the back leaned in, palms flat on the lid, challenging me to attempt it anew. Their beams threw elongated, distorted silhouettes over the drifts, twisting them into nightmarish forms. I fixed my gaze ahead, hunting for any firm terrain that might snag hold. All the while, the lead one drummed his fist on the pane, not in fury, but steadily, as if biding time for my resolve to crack first. What began as a simple breakdown had spiraled into a hunt, swiftly enough to jumble my mind. A sudden blast of wind tore through the branches overhead, dislodging a heavy slab of snow that slammed onto my car's hood. The noise jolted the two guys enough to buy me a brief moment to regroup. Seizing the chance, I began shifting the vehicle side to side within its tight confines. Initially, it stayed put. But soon, the rear right wheel bumped into a section of icier ground, still slick, yet rough enough to offer a subtle grip beneath the tires. The instant I sensed the difference, I pressed lightly on the accelerator. The car lurched abruptly, nearly sputtering to a halt, but the sudden motion made the guy right behind me jump aside to avoid being sideswiped. He yelled out words I couldn't quite catch, though the composure in his tone had clearly cracked. That shift alone spurred me to give it another go. The next try succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. The tire gained just sufficient hold to yank the vehicle from the incline, surging it ahead by a few yards. Without pausing to reflect or glance rearward, I floored it, allowing the car to swerve wildly down the path until it regained control. Through the rear view, the figures receded into shadowy outlines amid the blizzard, their truck idle with beams piercing the flurry like furious beacons. They made no move to pursue, as far as I could tell. I pushed on until the gale eased and the faint glow of far-off house lights emerged on the horizon, at which point I finally eased to the shoulder to catch my breath. I never bothered with a police report, lacking names, license numbers, or any solid proof. Yet every time the cold season rolls around and I'm navigating some isolated stretch, those odd vests and their purposeful strides flash in my mind. No doubt about it, their intentions that evening were far from helpful. Snowy outings weren't my usual scene in those years, but that season I was desperate to break free from my slump. So when my buddy Jordan proposed a short daytime trek along a well-known path close to his place, I agreed on impulse. Back then, my days were pretty subdued, handling work from home, hardly chatting with folks nearby, and filling weekends with efforts to ignore how trapped I felt. The route was known as a secure, clearly signed spot where groups with kids would head for snapshots after a new snowfall. That day, the heavens hung with a dull, powdery haze that drained depth from the scenery. Jordan kept cracking wise about how it resembled strolling inside a vintage greeting card. I recall how the chill sharpened every noise, turning them into crisp cracks that seemed nearer than they were, like branches snapping underfoot. At the outset, everything felt normal. We were simply pals aiming to dispel the seasonal gloom. The outing grew unsettling much quicker than we'd anticipated. Roughly an hour along, a piercing, desperate shriek cut through the forest, shrill, unfiltered, and full of terror. It was the sort that clamps your teeth together on reflex. Jordan halted in mid-sentence, fixing me with a look that questioned if I'd caught it too. It didn't match any creature I recognized, and immediately afterward, the surrounding timber fell into an odd hush, as though the entire area held its breath. We pressed on along the path for a bit, anticipating maybe another walker might dash by seeking aid. But nobody showed, and the quiet dragged on, thick and unnatural. I pulled my scarf higher, up over my mouth. Not from the freeze, but because the space around us suddenly seemed too exposed. In the end, our intrigue drew us from the marked route. With the powder still pristine, any passage through the zone should have shown traces, so we assumed we'd spot evidence of some distressed beast at minimum. What we discovered instead was a solitary row of human footprints. Firm, precise indents that angled toward a tight cluster of trunks, where limbs arched overhead like a warped gateway. No animal tracks, no signs of scraping, nothing hinting at nature's involvement. Jordan attempted a shout, but his words reverberated oddly, as if rebounding from some distant barrier. Those prints appeared fresh, perhaps only moments prior, and their even spacing sent a knot into my gut. They suggested calm, measured steps, not those of a person fleeing in panic. We trailed them just a ways before catching sight of him. Roughly 50 yards up amid the trunks, a figure in a shadowed jacket blanketed by flakes stood motionless, as if poised for our arrival. He offered no greeting, no words, not even a sway. He simply gazed our way with a focus that bit deeper into the chill. Jordan called again, yet the man remained unresponsive. He merely pivoted and continued into the thicker growth, his prints maintaining that tidy line. The deliberate, leisurely pace of his gait, almost like an invitation, stirred discomfort in me. Jordan argued against jumping to dire conclusions. Even so, when the stranger emerged once more, positioned even more remotely, but holding the identical stiff stance, a chill realization dawned. He was drawing us onward, not evading. Flurries continued to flutter in light, patchy veils as we ventured further among the trees, tracking the footprints in near silence. The marked path had disappeared in our wake, engulfed by the chilly atmosphere and the thick canopy above. Yet we both refused to acknowledge just how disoriented we'd become. Whenever we halted, a subtle noise would drift across the forest. At times, a brief, sharp wail. At others, it resembled a far-off sigh. It seemed as if the source of those sounds was perpetually just beyond view, relocating the instant we attempted to locate it. Jordan kept peering over his shoulder, anticipating the man's reappearance. But all that met his gaze was a muted, faded vista blurred by overcast hues. We caught sight of the man for the third instance, beside a weathered, partially collapsed pine tree. His jacket appeared bulkier, burdened by gathered frost, and he positioned himself at an odd tilt, feet rooted firmly while his torso inclined subtly ahead. What disturbed me the deepest was his absolute immobility. No trace of exhalation, no shoulder fidget, no shift against the chill. The moment he noticed our stare, he moved off into a slim gulch, flanked by twin elevations. It wasn't ordinary locomotion. It flowed too fluidly, nearly rehearsed, akin to retracing familiar ground, worn by repetition. Jordan grumbled that perhaps the fellow was hurt or disoriented, but I fixated on his utter lack of any plea for aid. The cries erupted once more piercing and nearer than previously. This round, they bounced amid the trunks in a deliberate pattern, as if broadcast from multiple spots. I halted so suddenly the frost pierced the rear of my legs. We strained to hear, truly tuning in, and discerned the reverberations weren't haphazard. They encircled us. Jordan murmured we ought to retrace our steps, yet the drifts had already obscured most of our tracks, rendering every route indistinguishable. The sole evident route remained the one he'd forged. Briefly, I sensed a juvenile impulse to shout and insist the screamer articulate plainly, utter something relatable, something anchoring. But my voice constricted whenever I attempted it. We pursued the gulch he'd entered, largely since it stood as the lone option that avoided sheer speculation. The atmosphere there hung denser, subdued in an unfamiliar outdoor manner. The foliage clustered so tightly, their limbs arched overhead like skeletal frames, and the ground cover appeared pristine below, save for the trail we persistently shadowed. Then Jordan clutched my arm and gestured. There he stood once more, motionless in the heart of a modest glade, poised. He raised a single limb, not gesturing or summoning, merely elevating it faintly to indicate a bearing. As we observed, the encircling timber unleashed a prolonged, grating howl, unlike any beast I recognized. It sounded staged, nearly automated, emanating from all sides simultaneously. The man dropped his arm and pivoted, vanishing amid a thicket so intertwined it resembled fused fabric. Jordan itched to bellow at him, to command he halt and clarify his intent. But the ensuing shriek silenced him. It originated directly at our rear, despite the emptiness there. I whirled so sharply my footwear skidded on the glaze, spotting only a slender cascade of powder from an overhead bough, as if disturbed moments prior by a fleeting presence. The ensuing quietude felt unnatural. It bore down upon us, dense and expectant, as if the woodland paused in anticipation of our decision. Jordan drew near and insisted we cease tailing the man, that we select a bearing and adhere to it. Certainty be damned. But honestly, any choice apart from his path evoked venturing sightless into oblivion. We hastened along, opting for a route that sloped gently upward, banking on it guiding us toward the primary crest. For a short while the woods grew serene, the noises fading into typical wintry stillness. Then the impressions resurfaced. Not our own, but his. Crossing our trajectory at a precise 90 degrees, suggesting he'd foreseen our deviation. They looked recent, uncannily so. Jordan froze mid-stride, fixated on them as though they'd materialized from the frost. I recall murmuring his name, a peculiar warmth surging within me, the sensation of scrutiny. We didn't glimpse the man immediately, but his proximity was palpable. The ambient air altered faintly, like a massive form had repositioned silently. Jordan noticed him first. The man loomed midway up the slope, oriented toward us this time. His outerwear draped oddly on his build, taut in improbable spots, and the surrounding powder appeared churned, despite his rigid stance. The most harrowing detail was his posture. His skull canted at such an angle it strained my own neck to behold, as if attuned to noises at our backs instead of facing us squarely. Jordan suggested in a hushed voice that we bypass the figure by circling around the hill and making for the open space he'd marked on the map before. But as soon as we veered off to the side, the stranger adjusted his position in a flash, matching our new path without budging an inch. It defied logic. Moments earlier, he was several yards distant. Suddenly, he was right back in sync with us, as if the space separating us had somehow crumpled. We took off running, not with any grace or courage, just raw survival drive. Twigs tore at our clothes. Powdered snow sprayed in our wake. My chest ached from the biting air. The trees merged into a haze of ivory and earth tones. For an instant, I couldn't have cared less about our heading, so long as it pulled us clear of him. At last, we burst into an open spot where a weathered signpost for the path poked out from under the drifts. I almost crumpled to the ground in exhaustion and gratitude. Help had to be nearby. In our trail, the forest fell into an eerie stillness. No howls, no pursuing steps, no silhouette lurking amid the trunks. The whole woodland seemed to have closed its gaze. Jordan and I barely exchanged words during the trek to the lot. We braced for another wail, or spotting that guy looming in our rear view, yet the silence held firm all the way. At the starting point of the path, 2 park officials were reviewing the notices on the board. They inquired whether we'd strayed from the route, mentioning they'd spotted tracks venturing into forbidden zones for the season. We recounted it all, the yells, each sighting of the intruder. One officer's expression grew tense, though he fought to conceal it. He explained how folks often lose their bearings in the chill, how noises play tricks in the frost, and how the mind can fabricate a pursuer out of nothing. Still, he murmured that should screams echo through those trees once more, we ought to exit right away. Skip the probing, ditch the bravery, just get out. We'll never know the stranger's identity or the reason his prints overlapped ours in spots we were certain we'd avoided. That path hasn't seen me since, and Jordan won't even pass through the vicinity by car. What lurked in there that afternoon sought no rescue. It craved drawing us further into the thicket. Had we delayed our flight, I'm doubtful we'd have escaped at all.